Hello, MGTOW. Hello, men. This is Howard Dare Actual. Thanks for stopping by. So, I may not have much more time with you. And so, I want to ask a question. And the question is, what is a good man? Now, the moment I say good, there's a great deal of ideas that are going to just circle around that idea, and an important aspect is good for who, right? So I'm speaking more along the lines of what is a viable man. And by viable, I mean able to sustain his own life in a manner that is positive and encouraging to him. Okay, so he builds his own way in the world and is able to make his way in the world. So that's what I'm talking about when I say, what is a good man? I mean a functional, working man. So what if there was an idea that if you held on to this idea, that there would be almost no way that you could become this viable good man? Because I'm suggesting that's exactly what there is. However, I don't want to upset, the vast majority of people. But I believe that this can help some of you. So what if we could insert into the minds of the young people that they all have an all-powerful fairy godfather or fairy godmother, right? This is a very comforting thought. You can understand how a child, the child mind, or anybody who's enduring a lot of difficulties might like to think to themselves that they have some all-powerful supernatural being who knows everything and can do anything at will, that's watching over them. And further, okay, that if they have the right mindset, the right set of feelings, that this fairy godfather will take care of them and deal with all their difficulties in life. Now, recognize that life is not easy. There are hard times. We are challenged. A life without challenges would be largely meaningless and empty. The idea is to become this good, viable man, able to deal with all that fate might throw at you in life. Can you see how if you wanted to build a house and it's a difficult task for you, could you see how perhaps sacrificing or praying to your fairy godfather with the idea that the fairy godfather is simply going to build or provide the house for you, can you see how this might be a crippling idea? Further, could you imagine the amount of stress that you would have to hold on to 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, knowing that there is some other being that can see and know everything about what you do? So you better be good, for goodness sake, right? We're talking about Santa Claus here. So you go to build the house, and it's not a very good job. The house doesn't even stand on its own. It just breaks down. The structure is not sound, and it falls down. Might you look to the skies and say, Fairy Godfather, why? Why have you not allowed me to build a good house? And might you then think that if you made additional sacrifices to the fairy godfather, that he might indeed give you the tools to build the house or even provide the house for you. And I could surely understand how a man or anybody would be upset. Their efforts were not suitable, were not strong enough to provide what they wanted. And therefore, they turn to the fairy godfather and they say, why? What have I done? What have I not done? You know everything. Am I not worthy of a viable structure? Now, let's contrast that with the man who does not believe that he has a fairy godfather, that the fairy godfather was a comforting thought as a child. But as he matured, he comes to rely upon his own abilities. So he builds the house, and again, it's not sound. It does not stand. And he doesn't turn to the fairy godfather. He looks to what he did. Perhaps he looks at other houses that do stand as a model of what he might like to build for himself. And he might think how what he is building and what they have built are different. And what could he do? What aspects of the viable, stable building could he incorporate into his design to make his building sound, secure, and viable? I think that's indeed exactly what he would do, right? He would say, well, this didn't work. What did I do wrong? Let me make the adjustments. Now, he doesn't have the comfort of the fairy godfather. All he has is his own ability and his own skills, with no supernatural force looking over his shoulder, judging his character, deciding whether or not he is worthy, if he is good enough. And what is good in this sense? Because it's not viable. It's conforming to the values of the fairy godfather. So if he conforms to the values of the fairy godfather strongly enough, the fairy godfather will provide for him. But the fairy godfather does not. And his house, no matter how much time or effort he puts into it, if he isn't making the necessary adjustments, it never becomes a viable, strong, stable house for him. Sometimes when I was younger, I would see a plane taking off into the sky. So the airplane's taking off, and I'm thinking, dear fairy godfather, please protect this airplane. Please protect the people on this airplane. I know that you, fairy godfather, can do anything at will. You could take this plane and transport it to another planet. You could take this plane and turn it into a helicopter. You could do anything. If the engines on this plane break and the wings fall off, you could cradle this plane in your hand and gently place it on the ground safely, because that's how powerful the fairy godfather is. And indeed, that's how powerful I want the fairy godfather to be. And then I might think, I am a good man. I have conformed to the rules and to the regulation and the laws of the fairy godfather. I hang out with other people who also are respectful of the fairy godfather. But as that plane flies off into the distance, I know that its destiny is determined by the will of a fairy godfather. And I did not like that feeling. I didn't like thinking, all of this could just explode at the will of a supernatural being, and only my worthiness, my goodness of character is determining this outcome. Over time, I came to think to myself, well, this is a viable, good airplane. And the pilots are fully trained, fully confident, fully comfortable. They can even deal with particular emergencies, like losing one of their engines or some damage, some mechanical damage. And based on that, based on the laws of aerodynamics, based on the training of the people using the machines, I could be fairly confident that this plane is going to make it to its destination. And this was a much more comforting thought to me. I didn't have to have this feeling of, have I appeased the fairy godfather well enough such that this plane will be safe? What if some moral, ethical failing within me, what if some weakness or problem within me is determining the outcome of this particular airplane? What a terrible, awful sense of responsibility. And, further consider, do you really think that my attitude towards the fairy godfather is what's determining whether or not this plane or this building or anything in my life is secure and viable? Might I exist in a state of constant appeasement to my imaginary fairy godfather? And might my entire life be out of my hands and at the will of this all-powerful fairy godfather? We all know that the fairy godfathers are not real. Life has its ups and downs, its good times, its bad times, its hard times, its easy times. I really shouldn't have stated it quite that way. And we are no longer children. So we no longer believe that a fairy godfather is determining the outcome of our lives. Because if we did, we would have no agency within our own lives, and we would have no security within our own lives. I've mentioned this story before. This was actually on the day that Robert F. Kennedy was assassinated. I was sent home, everybody was sent home from school on that day. And we were told, even though it was not the designated time for, to be picked up, that we were to just simply walk straight home. And I had recently, I could have only been about 7 or 8 years old, maybe even younger. And I had recently learned that the planet is rotating, okay? And I thought to myself, so I was walking home on my own, and I thought to myself, what happens if while the planet is rotating, the position of my house is shifted? Because it seemed like a reasonable, hey, if we're rotating, it seems like things might slip out of place, right? So I was a little worried, but I made my way home, and thankfully, the home was still there. Of course, my parents weren't, because we had been let go early. So I went into a field nearby and, just did my basic kid stuff, throwing rocks, picking up sticks, things like that. And perhaps I was a little worried or upset. And at that time, my favorite song was Puff the Magic Dragon, okay? I just loved that song. I had a few other favorites, but that was one of my top songs. And I was throwing rocks and throwing sticks, and I was singing my song, Puff the Magic Dragon. And as I threw the rock and it made its way on its arc, I thought to myself, why can't Puff the Magic Dragon just take this rock out of the sky and direct it someplace else? And I thought to myself, well, let's do that. But of course, it didn't happen. The arrow I shot into the sky continued on its trajectory. There might have been some wind to affect it, but there was no Puff the Magic Dragon. There was no fairy godfather. And I thought to myself, perhaps Puff the Magic Dragon is not real. And I became very sad, because I loved Puff the Magic Dragon. But I threw another rock, and I realized, no, this is the way of things. I throw the rock, it continues on its trajectory. No Puff the Magic Dragon comes, no fairy godfather comes. There might be a little bit of wind, but that's quite natural. And I thought, what a tragedy. The loss of magic, the loss of Puff the Magic Dragon, the loss of the fairy godfather. But then I realized that no, this is actually a good thing. Let the efforts of man be the efforts of man, and let not other forces interfere with that. Not the wind. The wind can interfere because it's part of the natural set of forces. And then I realized that if these physical laws are true, that we, as men, can understand these physical laws and harness these physical laws to our advantage. For example, I could make a paper airplane and it will fly. Maybe not a very good paper airplane, but, I can then improve upon it and it will fly. And I figured this is a pretty good deal, right? We get to make our way in the world free of magical influences, and that my house would still be where it was. It wouldn't just drift off into nowhere, and then I would become lost as a child. But I didn't think about it much more than that, and I moved on with my life I still liked the song. Now, growing up, I heard a lot more songs, and growing up, I watched a good number of those Disney movies, with a lot of fairy godmothers in there. And my actual mother, she wasn't that great. She had a drinking problem. She did the best she could, whatever. But I couldn't help but identify with the victims within these Disney movies and think to myself, where's my fairy godmother or father? My actual mother is, an alcoholic. And my father is busy at work. And when he comes home from work, he really does need to rest. And I thought, wouldn't it be nice if we all had a fairy godfather and a fairy godmother? But we don't. And so I grew up. Yet, given the difficulties of life, alcoholic mother, busy father, there was some suffering. There was some lack. It wasn't such a good life all the time. There were some problems. And I thought, well, if I'm a good enough person and I do the right things, things will turn out for me. You see that this is just another version of the fairy godfather, right? Sometimes the things turned out for me, and sometimes they didn't. Sometimes I took proactive steps to achieve what I wanted to have happen, and sometimes I didn't. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't, regardless of, what steps I took. And I was left in a kind of limbo space of what I do in my life is not the ultimate determinant of what my life becomes. There is some sort of magical, all-knowing, all-seeing being whose will can determine anything at the snap of a finger, that if I can appease this force, that I can have the good, viable, stable, secure life. But that didn't happen. Nor was I able to be so good. For example, when I was given some food, it wasn't always enough. I was still hungry, and I wanted more. But there was no more. And I looked to the skies, and I thought to myself, why, fairy godfather, why? Am I not worthy? Am I not good enough? I will do more. I will sacrifice more. Not only that, I felt kind of bad that the fairy godfather hadn't seen me as worthy enough to not give me a good mother. What had I done? to displease the fairy godfather. I was racked, even as an 8-year-old. Now, time went on, and life was hard. And the fairy godfather never seemed to show up and do what I needed him to do. Sorry about that. And so I became a bit angry and bitter towards the fairy godfather. I was like, you're not helping me. What the hell's going on? And a part of me said, I will try harder. And another part of me said, this is stupid. Grow up. But the basic idea was still there. And sometimes I would talk to other people, and their general idea was, well, you've clearly displeased the fairy godfather. Otherwise, you would have a good mother. And so I grew up. And I made efforts within my life to improve my life. And sometimes it worked, and sometimes it didn't. Sometimes I did all the right things, and it still didn't work. Other times I did nothing, and sometimes it worked out. Perhaps this is the fairy godfather at work behind the scenes, I suspected somewhere in the back of my mind. But then one day, after being afraid for all the airplanes in the sky, for all the suffering puppies, for all the alcoholic mothers who really aren't looking after their children, for all of the accidents, for all of the good things that happen to people, and for all of the bad things that happen to people, that the fairy godfather is not involved, that these things are clearly within the hands of the individual who is performing these things. And it occurred to me, as I said, I did not need to worry about the fate of that airplane because the laws of aerodynamics, the sound engineering principles, the well-trained operators, the statistics, which suggest that most of the time these planes are just fine, was a great comfort to me. And I guess I said to myself, well, the fairy godfather is not involved here. He doesn't seem to exist here. But if he does exist, he's just not bothering with this. But he might be involved in other things. So it's not that the fairy godfather does not exist. I wasn't ready to say anything like that to myself. This is, full-grown adult. But rather, he might exist, but he's not taking a concern with these events and affairs that I'm dealing with. But I better not make him angry, because if I do, he might come down here and, mess me up. He's not going to come down here and help me. He's not going to build the house for me. He's not going to protect the plane, where the wing falls off. But he might very well punish me and hurt me. And so I told myself to not rely upon the fairy godfather, but to be respectful of the fairy godfather. Well, life can be very hard, very harsh, very unforgiving, very cruel. You can be very much alone. You are very much alone at times. It's all up to you. And I realized that the thought of the fairy godfather was disempowering me and making me afraid. What if I displeased the fairy godfather? And it seemed that the fairy godfather was blessing some people and cursing other people. Why should one man have such a good life and another man, despite all of his efforts, not have a good life? Because this seemed to be the case. So it's not as if there is some fundamental principle of justice and goodness balancing all of this out, right? So it's not like everybody is destined to win $100,000 gambling, right? It's just a question of where and when, okay? It's not like that. Some person could go and gamble and they could win millions of dollars. Another person could gamble millions of dollars and lose it all. And it didn't seem to have anything to do with goodness. It just seemed to have to do with circumstance, happenstance, events, causality, inertia, force forces at work, objects in motion with forces acting upon them. And I felt that this was a pretty viable way to go forward, because fairy godfather's not, messing around down here, but he might, so play it safe. So this left me with the idea that I've got some supernatural, all-powerful, all-knowing being that can mess me up if it wants to, and that I better have the right attitude, right? So what is that attitude? The point is, it doesn't matter what that attitude is, all right? The moment that I believe that the fairy godfather is all-knowing and all-powerful and can do anything and is judging me, I am afraid. I am afraid that the rock I throw in one direction can simply be diverted into another direction. I am afraid that when the plane takes off, no matter how good its design, no matter how trained its pilots are, if the character of myself or maybe someone on the plane isn't up to snuff with fairy godfather, that plane could come down. So there is no house that I can build that won't be at the will of the fairy godfather, who never helps, but may hurt and punish. What a crippling thought, isn't it? So my medical degree, my engineering degree, is not to be determined by my study and the tests and my knowledge of the field. These things are part of it, but there's also the fairy godfather. Perhaps I'm going to school and I'm getting good grades and I like the material, but someone there doesn't like me, and they say Howard Dare is a cheater. And even though I'm not, the people in power decide, indeed, and we are going to punish him. We are going to take away his ability to, achieve this degree. Well, that's unfair. Let that word sink in a little bit. Unfair. It's a powerful word. It's a powerful concept. How many times a day do you think to yourself, that's unfair? Now, when you think such a thing, to who do you turn? Do you say, well, this is the nature of existence. Some things work out, some things don't. For the most part, if we do the right and good things, understand how packed those words are, that we will have the good and right outcome. And indeed, this seems to be the case most of the time. What if the word good itself was to mean nothing more than appeasing the imaginary values of a fairy godfather? Not good as in viable or sustainable, but good as in the majority of people approve. What if that's what good means? What if when I say, that is unfair, I was good, I want some sort of correction, some sort of justice? What if the word good meant slave to foolish ideas? How many houses could I build? Do you think any airplane that I could build would stay afloat? Would stay in the sky? It's not operating according to the laws of aerodynamics. It's not sound mechanical engineering. It's not well-trained operators. It's people who are in the good graces of their fairy godfather. What a disempowering thought that might be. I'm hoping you can see how this could potentially cripple somebody their entire lives. So when I was a child, I thought as a child, and I held on to these thoughts. But the world itself, through harsh experience, indicated to me that these thoughts had nothing to do with the outcomes that I had in life. And that indeed, these thoughts of the fairy godfather were crippling me in my ability to learn the engineering principles to build a house, because I was relying on the fairy godfather. So I guess all I'm really saying to you is for a day or two, you may want to try just being your own man. And I know that sounds kind of cruel, but no fairy godfather, no fairy godmother, no winning the approval of the majority of people who believe in the fairy godfather or mother. Just you. No fairy godfather looking over your shoulder, knowing everything that you think and do, and determining your fate and destiny in life, but rather that it be in your own hands. And that good does not mean the approval of the people who believe childish things around you, but that good actually means of benefit to you. I'm suggesting you give that a try for a day or two. And I would console you and say, I don't think that the fairy godfather would mind if you did this and tried it out for a day. Maybe your fairy godfather has to go on vacation for a week. Maybe your fairy godfather has a lot of other people that he is godfather to, and wants you to do it on your own for a while. So burn the ships, okay? Stop with the group think excuses. You want universal love? Well, then you have no personal love, all right? You want to love everybody equally? Then you have nobody that you can love especially. You want to exist for the good of mankind? Then we can throw the good of your life out the window. I don't think your fairy godfather is going to punish you for stepping up and trying to take more responsibility. I also think that taking your life in your own hands will give you a feeling of agency and power. And by extension, thinking that you have, your fairy godfather, I think that it disempowers you and cripples you. And that the word good, when it's defined by getting along with the majority of people around you, is a twisted, incorrect definition of good. That you need to define good for you, for your life. So I would say, what is the purpose of your life? And a lot of people would say to live a good life, right? But of course, good to them means getting along with the majority of the people around them. To be good in the eyes of the fairy godfather, to be good in the eyes of whatever it is the majority takes to be good. But what if the majority thinks that you're not very good and you don't deserve a good life, and that it should all be sacrificed for their good? Why? Because they need it, because they're weak, because they're suffering. You don't want to see people suffer, do you? I mean, you're a good person, aren't you? So give your fairy godfather or mother a break. Give them a vacation. Step in to the role of your own. Pretend that they don't exist for a little while, okay? See if that doesn't give you a little bit more comfort. Understand that the comfort that we're looking for is an infant's formation of the basic ego. That's all it is. You want to return to a state of oneness with the universe where child is in the crib, okay? The child feels discomfort. Maybe the diaper messed, maybe it's hungry and it wants a bottle. And it isn't even deeply aware that it feels what it feels, but it cannot be denied. There is the feeling, and it is a discomfort, an unease. And so they cry out. And in most cases, they are appeased. Their crying out is appeased. And they come to the realization that there is an external world, that they exist and they have feelings, and that there is an external world with which they must interact in order to continue to feel good, or they will feel bad. Like it might get very cold at night and they would certainly like a blanket. And the parents hopefully provide these things. The child cries out, the parent provides. And they are separate from this world of the parent. They don't really understand this world of the parent, but it can appease them for a time. Of course, life goes on. They become older. They have greater needs and wants. But crying out isn't going to supply their needs. No, taking action, taking the proper, viable action, building the good house on sound engineering principles. That will give them what they want. But that's hard work. That's real sacrifice. And you could do everything right and it could still not turn out. Not because you're a bad person, but because of causality, because things happen and they don't always work out the way you want them to, and you don't always understand the principles involved. But if you're looking to a fairy godfather to correct this for you, I think you're going to be very disappointed, very angry, very afraid, very frustrated, and even hedging your bets, which is what I was trying to do for you, with you, with the idea of, you're going to step into the role of your own fairy godfather and take over for a week because, and I don't think your fairy godfather is going to be angry at you if you do that. And I want you to see what type of empowerment and strength, viability and agency this will empower you with, but I don't want you to get in trouble with your fairy godfather. I don't want you to go against your own nature. Is it your nature to have a fairy godfather? Certainly there's some advantages, or there's certain moral, ethical ideas that this could hold you to, and that for the majority and even for yourself, this could be an advantage. So the fairy godfather idea doesn't have to be real for it to have some benefit. And again, it doesn't have to be real for it to cripple you your entire life. So this is just a thought. This is just an idea. This is just an experiment that if you're feeling brave, I want you to try it out. Okay? And further, let me say that, I appreciate all of my MGTOW brothers, all that MGTOW has done for me. I wish I could do more. Perhaps I will be able to moving into the future. I should know in about another month or so. But I could also just be stuck in limbo for the rest of the time, looking to my fairy godfather and saying, why, right? That's a terrible feeling. But knowing that I have some agency and some things that I can do that will affect the outcome, that's very empowering. And that's what I hope will happen. So let me know what you think about this in the comment section below. Please like, share, comment, subscribe, donate. MGTOW, you are my only support. There's no advertisement here. I'm not selling merchandise. This is just me talking to you. So if you're in a position to help me out with the Howard Dare channel and with what I'm trying to accomplish, please do so. I would greatly appreciate it. There'll be a link in the description and in the comments section.